All right, Father Richard. Well, first of all, thank you on behalf of Spiritual Directors International and all of our members for agreeing to participate in our conference in St. Louis. And I just wanted to just chat with you a little bit about the topic of spiritual diversity in the spiritual direction public square. But before I do that, I wondered if you'd be willing to share some brief thoughts about your latest book.
Yeah, I just finished a book on what I'm calling the Universal Christ, although the title that the publisher is giving it is Another Name for Everything, Another Name for Everything. Because the point I make, and we'll have time to elaborate on this at our conference, and this is not a stretch, this is not unorthodox or heretical, but it's utterly new to most Christians, that Christ is not Jesus' last name. Christ existed from all eternity, right? And that's very clear in Paul's letter in Ephesians, Colossians, the prologue to John's Gospel, the first paragraph of Hebrews. It's all through the scriptures, but you know, you can't see what you're not told to pay attention to. And the first 2,000 years, Christianity was, I'll just say, so in awe of the incarnation of God as we believed in Jesus, that we never really got to recognize that Christ was a bigger and an older and a larger category than Jesus. Jesus became the Christ. Jesus revealed the Christ. And that's very clear already in Acts of the Apostles. But you can see how this really affects what we're concerned about here. We're dealing with the basis for a universal religion that doesn't need to be in competition with any other religion. When we pull Jesus into our tribal worldview and made him German and Italian and French and Spanish, and used him, I mean, I don't mean to be irreverent, but sort of as our, divine mascot for our national religion, we just ended up with a very small version of Jesus. And we've seen this in our inability to rise above racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, name all of them. We just didn't have a big enough frame. So what I'm praying and hoping I can do in this book is make that clear to people, that we're actually coming from what, for want of a better word, I'm going to say a natural religion, a natural, something that's based in nature. And that's why the native religions or ancient Hinduism suddenly become much more believable, attractive. What they were intuiting, sometimes with greater clarity than we are intuiting today, is what the Christ mystery is trying to say. So I hope this lays a foundation for our diversity dialogue. It does for me, at least.
Your answer brings to mind Raimundo Panikkar, and
oh, yes.
Who I'm sure would have resonated with what you have just said in very deep and meaningful ways, given his own writings and his own beliefs. And I wonder if you could, and I use Raimundo as an example because he traveled broadly and became engaged with Vedanta and Hinduism, Buddhism on a very deep level without ever really leaving his grounding as a devout and committed Christian. And he wrote very eloquently about seeing Christ everywhere. And I think he meant Christ in the sense that you just
I'm quite sure. Yeah.
And so I wonder if you I've been thinking quite a bit about him
good.
lately, and so I wondered if you wanted to say a little more about basically how our core religious identity manifests universally and not in competition or threatened by any other expression of faith.
Now, we recommend several of Panikkar's books in our living school here in Albuquerque. especially Christophany, which has got to be one of his great masterpieces. I would think, of course, he's got a mind 10 times better than mine. He's a scholar. I'm just a Franciscan popularizer. That's all I am. God gave me enough to be able to read people like Panikkar, but then my desire is to bring that to the ordinary person on the street who doesn't have to have a degree in theology, can understand the gospel. So I would think that whatever I'm trying to say in this new book would make people able to open books of Panikkars, like the Hidden Christ of Hinduism. My God, what a title. They could open such books and not be shocked, but be totally ready to say, oh my gosh, he's onto it, you know? So if I can lead people back to scholars like him, I'm very happy to do that, because I'm not really a scholar myself, just enough of a scholar to understand the scholars, but that's a different level. It's a very different level.
I don't want to, you've been very generous with your time, and I don't want to take up too much more. I do have one more question.
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's related to, you know, our religious identity. I've asked this question of the other keynote speakers at the SDI conference, Mirabai Starr and Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams as well, which is to address the issue of our core religious identity, whatever that might be, yours as a Christian or mine as a Buddhist, or you know, Mirabai's as a little bit of everything, if you will.
Inner spiritual, yeah.
Spiritual. What happens when we come into contact, communication with faith traditions that, at least on the surface, seem very dissimilar to our own? How do you perceive that process of engagement across the boundaries? And of course, you know, make a theological argument that those are arbitrary boundaries anyway, but across some of the tribal boundaries that people sometimes perceive around their religious identity. How do you see engaging with people from other faith traditions, and what does that mean to you?
Well, let me say, you know, such dialogues, as important and needed as they are usually only fruitful by people who've moved to the mystical, non-dual, contemplative levels of their own religion. We need them, and we've all been to ecumenical services where we show respect to one another, and I'm very grateful for that. But we don't get into the deeper subterranean assumptions, because most people don't have the background for using a communal language. They think they're abandoning their own. What's inner experience gives you is the ability to, and that's all I mean by mysticism, by the way, is inner experience. Once you have inner experience of union with love, with God, with the divine, you move beyond the symbol system. You move beyond the ritual system. You still respect it, but once you get to that deeper level, I can go into a Hindu temple in India and fully honor and respect the lovely people coming in with their candles and their oil and bowing and chanting, and my God, what else are they doing except worshiping the same God that I love through Christ? But that does take, almost all religions start at the external level. What else could you do? You start with the external rituals, but what we haven't told our people is that all words, even religious words, are metaphors. That's the only language available to religion, is metaphor. It's like. But when we don't tell that early on, people spend their whole life protecting the metaphor, really, and worshiping the metaphor. Sort of the way Americans worship the American flag as a substitute for true loyalty to their country. They take the symbol and make a quasi-God out of it. So this is a human tendency to just take symbols and make them substitutes for the reality. So we do it in nation states, and we certainly do it in religion. So maybe just saying that might give some people permission to not get idolatrous toward the symbols, because that's the correct word. And I learned that word from Judaism. I mean, the only real sin in the Hebrew scriptures is making something God that is not God. Making something, and that's called idolatry. And religion in all of its permutations is highly guilty of idolatry. It takes its symbols as an excuse to eliminate and exclude the other symbols, forgetting that they're metaphors. And I'm not trying to be some, new age liberal that flattens the universe out. Quite the contrary. I'm trying to invite people into the depth of things, not trying to create a flat land. And that's why I still encourage people to be loyal to their primary tradition, to go deep in one place, as I've often put it. And there you discover the Rio Abajo, the deeper stream, and no religion threatens you anymore. In fact, every religion invites you.
Yeah. One final little question that can be a quick answer from you is, you've pointed to mysticism as the entry point to the deeper waters.
That's right. Yeah.
To the deeper waters, and given your grounding in the Christian tradition, which of the mystic or mystics have most helped you gain entry into those deeper waters?
Well, of course, as you know, I'm a Franciscan, so I began very much by first the life of Francis, but then the theology of people like Bonaventure, who took Francis's intuition and made a world philosophy out of it, So I had the best of both, the simplistic intuition of a Francis and the academic brilliance of a systematic Bonaventure, but both building on the same foundation. Then I'd have to say, after that, my big outstanding mystics who've been personal teachers to me have been Julian of Norwich, the English woman, and Therese of Lisieux, the French nun, and the great Teresa, the Spanish mystic of Avila, John of the Cross. And of course, everybody mentions those two, but legitimately so. I mean, it's amazing in a country like Spain, which was so super Catholic, right after the Reformation, when everybody else is circling the wagons around a kind of rigid Catholicism, you have these two people emerge in Spain who really are charting the universal journey of the soul toward God, I mean, they would have still used their Catholic 16th century Spanish language, but not really. If you really read them, they're developmental psychologists, developmental spiritual psychologists. And so they will continue to stand. I've often called them the last supernova of Catholic mystical teaching, after we basically descended into 450 years of defensive, aggressive Catholicism that considered everybody else a heretic, So it was like God gave us a light so we wouldn't go into that small hole, but we did anyway, while quoting Teresa and John of the Cross. And I've even had my Carmelite friends who love Teresa and John who said, we honored them because they were Carmelites, but we didn't know what they were talking about. Because, post Council of Trent, when all Christian groups circled the wagons around their own denominational theology, there was no room for understanding mysticism. And Owen Barfield calls the last 500 years the desert of non-participation. That's his phrase, where Western Christianity was no longer communicating on any broad level. Certainly individuals got it, but on any broad level, there was no communicating of one's participation with the divine. It all had to be earned by technique, Bible quotes, formulas, sacraments, that it wasn't highly experiential.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Father Richard. This
You're
is
welcome.
wonderful, and will be a wonderful gift and blessing, and tantalizing for our attendees in St. Louis. And so, thank you for
You're
this.
most welcome.